the lectures was about shophouse architecture. Well, I discussed with Faisal and I thought that it was more sensible, it was more, possibly, hopefully more fun, if we were to do not a talk, a lecture, because you all know it all, and you've had a lot of things emailed to you in terms of materials that you can read. So that kind of information is something that you would do naturally on your own as experienced guides and as trainers and as potential trainers. So that's one of the things. So I thought that what would be more sensible for this morning would be to start here and to talk a little bit about why we did this project related to Malacca's World Heritage Listing inscription. And Rosalie can... Rosalie, where are you, law?
Here.
Why are you hiding?
No conversation. Mine finished.
I will ask you questions. So why we did this, and then I'm going to set you on a couple of, and we will do a bit of a walk, and we will look at a couple of other things. Also related just to Heeren Street, I'm not going to take you away from Heeren Street, just as an exemplar within the World Heritage Site. Now, if I'm talking too quickly, just tell me. If you have any questions, just tell me. I'll try and look up. And if I don't, just say, oi, Elizabeth, and I'll look up. All right? Okay. But before I start, I just want to introduce you to Raymond and Colin. Okay, Colin and Raymond, Colin's upstairs. Okay, Colin's the manager at this center here, and Raymond assists him. And Colin's been with us for 10 years, and which is great. And Raymond, you've been with us for about 4 years? 4 years now, so that's really fantastic. When we first, I think this was in the year 2000, and things were hotting up in terms of this suit for inscription for Malacca and for Georgetown. And Georgetown was going on one path, and Malacca was kind of going on its own path. You know, they were not exactly in parallel. And one of the things that was happening in Malacca is because Malacca is, as you have seen, because you've just come up St. Paul's Hill, and as you've seen, is just that much older. It is Malaysia's oldest, most ancient city. It has a history, a contemporary, a modern history of as a town of 100 to 600 plus years. It isn't new, you know. Georgetown is much newer. I'm talking about modern Georgetown. I'm not talking about Pulau Pinang. I'm not talking about, you know, the vernacular story of Penang. I'm talking about what you see as the World Heritage Site, this modern port city. And when you look at Malacca, Malacca has just that much longer history. And Malacca's also had so many more interventions. You know, Georgetown was there kind of a bit, the Penang Island was there, and that the relationship with Kedah, as you know. And basically, although there was some shipping, and people stopped there to get water and things like that, there was no real big modern development until the British kind of came and put their footprint there, right? Whereas in Malacca, you're looking at a history that goes back to the 14th century, 15th century, 14 something, and you're looking at a situation that progressed from the Malacca Sultanate to colonial rule through the Portuguese and the Dutch, and then eventually taken over by the British before independence. Yeah, so it has had more interventions. Now, one of the things that happened in terms of the interventions was the lack, I think, of understanding at the time that we started looking at Malacca in the year around 2000, 2001, of properties like this. This is small. It is extremely modest in scale, in look, in feel. If you look at the ground in front of you, here, this air well, what you're sitting on, this granite curb, is not original. This was what, when we removed it, you know, there was just lots of concrete over it, and when we removed it, that was what we found. We found tiles, we found bricks. And this kind of place didn't have electricity. It had a well. It didn't actually have piped water when we came in. And this well is a shared well. And when we were doing the restoration of this place, one of the things we found was actually the well was there first before this wall. So it was actually one side, the rear side. The front was there. This front portion, the upstairs, you can go and have a look at it afterwards. But this back was open. So then somebody put the wall up, and hence the well got cut into two. Now, if you look at early maps of Malacca, you will see where they indicate where there are wells, and this was one of the sites, okay? And the reason why we knew this wall came up later was in the restoration, what we had done was, you know, you strip off all the plaster and you look at the brick. And so the construction of the brick was this wall was there first, and this wall then came in and met it at a later date. So that was how we kind of knew. We also knew what it had been used for, really just through the investigation of looking at, apart from stories, people saying, yeah, you know, this was a kuli king and things like that. This little room that is used for the office, when we were scraping off, we found lots of tar from opium. So we knew people smoked opium. And we knew that they had smoked opium in that room because we had the evidence of that. Now, so coming back to why we did this house, we found that there was a study that was an informal study that was being undertaken, looking at mapping the physical architecture of Malacca. And it had gone on from the 1980s. You know, there were many actually series of studies. Started with Badan Warisan doing certain things, and then UTM coming and doing certain things. PERSIM were definitely, you know, Rosalie will tell you the Malacca Museum, not PERSIM. PERSIM. Oh, they don't know PERSIM. Doesn't PERSIM exist anymore?
Yes.
Okay. The Malacca Museum, which is PERSIM, okay, which was also under the enactment set up, were also doing documentation, and they were all looking at the physical place. But we started looking at this type of building as one of the earliest examples of a brick building in an urban setting, in a town in Malaya. So that really is, if you start digging, and then you go back and you say, well, can I find something which is brick in George Town? What does it date to? The early 19th century. We were looking at brick buildings that dated to the 18th century in Malacca. And not what you see there, laterite block. There would be buildings with laterite stone, walls, etc. But we were looking at basically an urban structure. And it became clear to us in this investigation that because these buildings were seen as Dutch period, there were certain renovations that were being done by a lot of these buildings. Okay, there were two things. One were the buildings were left completely derelict, and the other was renovations were being done. And the renovations were being done to add what they thought were Dutch features. But sometimes they weren't even Dutch features, they were what you thought was a Dutch feature, or what you thought was a Peranakan feature, because Malacca has to be Peranakan, right? You know, and that's the general impression. It was not a very educated, I'm not saying people were not educated, but it wasn't a scholarly, it wasn't a researched understanding. Because a lot of the studies, and including the study done by Badan Warisan, was only looking at the physical presence of this place. We looked at what was happening on the street, and it was very much acknowledged that buildings of this kind contributed to the character of the town. However, they were classified grade 3 buildings, category 3 buildings. Some people call it grade 3, some people call it. Now, a category 3 building, by definition, could be demolished, reworked, redone. Although, if you think about the way in which it was categorized, a category 3 building is a building that contributes very definitely to the street edge. You would have thought that a Category 3 building would be something that really needed to be kept rather than got rid of. But because that was happening quite a lot, because there was this lack of, I think, awareness, it wasn't so much, education, it was a lack of awareness. There were these changes because people thought, hey, I'm going to upgrade. You upgrade your houses, you upgrade a place like this. So you go through that process. Well, at that time, UNESCO was doing various projects, and they were also doing some monitoring missions of different parts of the world, and this was Asia Pacific, in the Asia Pacific region. Malacca was one of the sites they were monitoring. It wasn't because they didn't like Malacca, but actually I think it was because they liked Malacca and they wanted to make sure that Malacca could reach this position of World Heritage listing. And so what they did was they had evaluators come out, basically have a look at it. And one of the things that one of the evaluators found was that this particular building, which is technically the oldest urban form in terms of shop house, was being lost. And when we did a count, I think it was of something like 300 over buildings, what we found was that a great percentage, that means under 10%, was intact. It was intact, meaning there were very few physical changes to the appearance, but a lot of them, although they were intact, were not in good condition. And this is when we come to this building. So one of the things that Badan Warisan decided to do in the year 2001 was to do a pilot project. Badan Warisan loves to do pilot projects. We do pilot projects all the time. Okay? So this was a pilot project that we decided that we would do because we wanted to find a way to support Malacca's drive for inscription. And there were many buildings of this nature around, but a lot of them were owned by private owners. And it was one of the things that we said, look, if we do a private house and we find the money and we do it, it goes back to the private owner. And then what happens? Coincidentally at this time, if you all remember your history, the Rent Control Act, which had been repealed in 1997, took effect in the year 2000. And with the Rent Control Act taking effect, a lot of these buildings were also emptied out. This also being one of them. It was really in very poor condition, like I said. And the building next door was in better condition, but it had been changed quite a lot. And this its twin, I think they were like Siamese twins almost, yeah? Was in very poor condition, but it was very intact. It is owned by the Cheng Hun Teng Incorporated. So it is owned by a community group. And that was one of the things that we thought, hey, if they're interested in working with us, and we can work with them, we would be able to do a project and teach ourselves, but also raise awareness of the type of building and the importance of this typology in terms of shophouse architecture to Malacca. Okay? And to Malaysia, as a matter of fact, because remember, you don't find it in Taipei, you definitely don't find it in Johor, I don't know where, you will never find it in Kuantan, you're just not going to find it except in terms of a date and age, except in Malacca. So that was what made it critical. So to cut the long story short, we ended up restoring this over a period of time. We had we set ourselves one task. And I suppose we had the luxury of doing it because we were not commercial. And we received a grant which funded about 2/3 of the cost. We decided that we wanted to see whether all the work could be done in Malacca by Malaccans with material sourced only in Malacca. And that was a task we set for ourselves. It doesn't mean that so the tiles that you see, these terracotta tiles, we found in Malacca, but they were from Vietnam. But a supplier had brought them in, and then the person who asked for it to be brought in, nobody wanted it, they did. So we managed to get them, and they fitted our needs. They were unglazed terracotta tiles, that was what we wanted, etc. So we were able to get a contractor in Malacca to work with us. He had Indonesian workers, but he worked with us. So the woodwork, for example, was done by an Indonesian. Okay, not all. The line plaster was done by locals. Okay, and so we were able to just progress this restoration.